I recognize the Associate Minister of Children and Women's Issues.
Thank you, Speaker. Today is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, a day designated by the United Nations to raise awareness on gender-based violence. Today, our government would like to acknowledge the work that's been done and recommit ourselves to action. November 25th marks the launch of the Unite to End Violence Against Women campaign. 16 days of activism against gender-based violence that concludes on International Human Rights Day. This campaign, led by the United Nations, aims to prevent and eliminate violence against women and girls here in Ontario and around the world. It calls for global action to increase awareness, promote advocacy, and create opportunities for discussions on challenges and solutions. Speaker, the bravery of gender-based violence survivors is around us, but it is often hard to see. That's why throughout the month of November, we ask Ontarians to wear a purple scarf to show support for survivors who've had to endure gender-based violence in their homes, communities, and workplace. The purple scarf is a symbol of the courage it takes to seek support and safety from violence. Wearing a purple scarf also supports the Wrapped in Courage campaign, which is organized by women's shelters across Ontario every November to raise awareness of violence against women and children. I want to thank the Ontario Association of Interval and Transition Houses and their Executive Director, Marlene Ham, for this initiative and for everything they're doing to support victims of domestic violence and survivors of human trafficking. Speaker, over the past 25 days, communities across Ontario have hosted events to raise awareness and support victims of domestic violence. As Ontario's Associate Minister of Children and Women's Issues, I had the honour of attending a flag-raising ceremony this morning here in Toronto at Nathan Phillips Square. And this month, I've announced key investments by our government to support survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking, including $2 million for the Victim Crisis Assistance Ontario program to ensure victims of crime and their families have access to services and supports they need. $18.5 million over 3 years to support survivors of domestic abuse and human trafficking by increasing access to safe and affordable housing, employment assistance and childcare through the Transitional Housing Support Program. Speaker, before the COVID-19 pandemic, the statistics on gender-based violence were grim. Approximately 137 women around the world are killed by their partner or a member of their family every day. And almost 1 in 3 women globally, around 736 million women, will be physically or sexually abused by a partner in their lifetime. We know that gender-based violence and femicide has not gone away during COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, it's gotten worse. This year in Ontario, it has increased more than 52%, Speaker. This tragic reality has become so widespread that the United Nations now refers to it as a silent, lethal shadow pandemic. As a mother of 5 and grandmother of 4 and counting, this trend concerns me. In my role as Associate Minister, I'm proud to be part of a government that is committed to preventing and taking action to address violence against women and girls in all forms. That's why this year my ministry is investing $202 million on important violence against women initiatives. These dollars will fund emergency shelters, counselling, 24-hour crisis lines, safety planning, child witness program, transitional and housing supports, and much more. Our government also added another $2.1 million over 3 years to expand victim and sexual assault services in rural and underserved communities. This is on top of the $3.6 million we invested last year as part of our Rural and Remote Enhancement Fund. And last year we launched our 5-year strategy to combat human trafficking and the sexual exploitation of children and youth. This comprehensive $307 million action plan is focused on raising awareness, early intervention, protecting victims, and holding offenders accountable. Speaker, our coordinated approach involves multiple ministries and sectors coming together across government to provide a variety of programs and supports for survivors, their families, and communities. Services like 24-hour crisis line offering telephone assistant information and referrals. Violence against women shelters, which provide emergency housing, counseling, and supports. Traditional housing supports and services to help victims of domestic violence and survivors of human trafficking find and maintain housing and help them transition to independence. Hospital-based sexual assault and domestic violence treatment centres that offer 24/7 emergency medical care, crisis intervention, and counseling. A court-based, the Victim Witness Assistant Program that provides emotional support, court preparation, and other services for victims and witnesses of crime. A network of sexual assault centres that provide free counseling, information, and supports for those who've experienced sexual violence. 24/7 language interpretation service to help victims of domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking. Public education initiatives to raise awareness and prevent violence against women and youth. And training in communities and workplaces to help frontline employees and bystanders identify risk factors and how to safely intervene when they observe sexual violence or sexual harassment. And our Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, Minister Clark, has provided over $700 million through the Social Services Relief Fund to support Ontario's most vulnerable, including those who are homeless and women fleeing violence. This includes $40 million under the COVID-19 Residential Relief Fund to help address increased residential costs at frontline agencies and emergency shelters, plus an additional $1 million to help frontline agencies adapt to remote service delivery to ensure continued operation during the pandemic. Speaker, to address the calls for justice in the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, our government released Pathways to Safety, a strategy developed in close partnership with Indigenous communities, organizations, and the Indigenous Women's Advisory Council. As part of this strategy, this year's 2021 budget included an $18.2 million investment over 3 years to support 118 initiatives to help end violence against First Nations, Inuit, Métis women and girls. We're working to address the crisis facing Indigenous women by increasing access to community supports, expanding resources for First Nations police services for sexual assault, human trafficking, and domestic violence investigations, and building on investments we've already made to support community safety and provide additional supports. And under Ontario's Indigenous Healing and Wellness Strategy, we're also contributing an additional $3.6 million in funding to Indigenous-led healing and wellness programs. This includes culturally responsive family violence healing and prevention programs in First Nations and urban and rural Indigenous communities. Speaker, since I became Associate Minister in June, I've met with frontline workers, visited violence against women shelters and stakeholders, and I've asked for their advice on how we can better support them experiencing violence. I've heard from survivors on their journey to healing about the importance of wraparound services, including counseling and well-being supports, social assistance programs, employment assistance, schooling, childcare, education, and legal supports. Speaker, our government is committed to helping women and children impacted by domestic violence and human trafficking. We're committed to giving women the support they need to walk away from every vicious act and never look back. Regardless of political stripe, I know that everyone in this House today shares our government's commitment to ending violence against women and girls in all forms. I want to acknowledge and express my sincere gratitude to the incredible crisis counsellors, shelter workers, child protection workers, and everyone who works day in and day out to support victims of domestic violence and survivors of human trafficking. Women in crisis look to you for comfort, healing, and direction. Your kindness, empathy, and tireless efforts to support women and children fleeing violence and abuse makes a life-changing difference. Speaker, violence against women could not be tolerated in any form, in any context, in any circumstance. I am proud of the work we are doing across government and with our partners to break the cycle of violence, to do everything that we can to ensure everyone in Ontario can live their lives free of violence. This is very personal for me, Speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.